It's your boy Judaic Black. Shalom L'Chaim, purified drinking water. Got the water. Don't forget, man, get that Hanukkah box up down there. Link is in the bio, or in the description, whatever. Click, subscribe, whatever. Yeah. So this next video, this is more or less about blacks in Mexico, which we would say New Spain back then, or our Mexican, Hispanic, Latino brothers and sisters, y'all involved in this one too. So I'm not gonna waste no more time, just gonna get right on up into that. This is the history of blacks in Mexico. Like I said, we gotta crunch this information in. I gotta get it all in to get to my point. So hopefully we get to that next week, man. Let's just keep pumping this information in, y'all. Gotta know history before I start to tell you other things, right? So here we go. Cue that music I like.
I don't think twice. Just keep it out of my sight there. Well, bitch, don't kill my vibe. Oh, bitch, don't kill my vibe. Well, American privilege keeps blurring my vision. Inherited sickness.
Gaspar Yanga. Gaspar Yanga is popular as the Primer Libertador de America, or First Liberator of the Americas. He is notable for leading one of colonial Mexico's first successful slave uprisings, and would go on to establish one of America's earliest free black settlements. Gaspar, often called Yanga, or Nyanga, was born on May 14, 1545. He is said to be one of the Brand people from the royal lineage of Gabon, located in today's West Africa, where he was born and raised, before he was captured and sold into slavery in Mexico, and given the name Gaspar Yanga after his capture. Yanga was an enslaved worker in the sugarcane plantations of Veracruz, Mexico, while working under terrible conditions. In 1570, Yanga was able to convince some group of people, and with his group of new followers, revolted against their captors and were able to escape. They fled through the mountainous regions near Cordoba and established a settlement of former slaves called the Palanque. Yanga was able to bring the free slaves to a new settlement and established a community where they were able to live freely without any interference or disturbance from the Spanish authorities for more than 40 years. Yanga assumed the role of spiritual and military leader and was able to structure an agricultural community that performed effectively and also produced in an ordered capacity. Under his leadership, the community easily grew in strength and was able to expand to other locations, although there is no clear record of how this movement developed. By 1609, this community of former slaves included more than 500 men, and consequently, there were rumors that Yanga and his men were planning a large-scale revolt against the Spanish authorities. Yanga also had a band called the Cimarrones. While this group helped to ensure order and calm in the community, Yanga and his band were perceived as being a threat to the colonial system of slavery, as they acted in a daring manner and opposed activities of the royal commerce and authority. Indeed, Yanga and his men grew in power and influence and became a threat to the Spanish government. Warnings increased during the reign of Viceroy Luis de Velasco, and the Viceroy was alerted of a possible black uprising. According to the rumors, this uprising would see the runaways murder whites and name a black maroon as king. De Velasco didn't give much attention to these rumors at first, but rather ordered the severe whipping of several enslaved people who had already been imprisoned for other kinds of crimes. After some period, the band was implicated in the disruption and looting of trade goods. Yanga's maroon not only plundered the haciendas and farms in order to survive, they also attacked the Viceroyalty-era Mexico-Veracruz Road. This was along the Camino Road, also known as the Royal Road, which lies between Veracruz and Mexico City. It was an important road that connected the Gulf's main port with the capital of New Spain. The band was also held responsible for attacking nearby haciendas and kidnapping indigenous women. The continuous attacks became a source of trouble for the authorities. Throughout the colonial period, the roads where these attacks were prominent was the most used transit and communication route in the Americas, and its economic importance was essential for the development of Spain. The attacks got the Viceroy upset, and he sent some militias to subdue Yanga and his group. The their community was eventually attacked, and they tried to destroy Yanga and his group. They assumed that destroying the community and its leader would serve as a deterrent to other would-be rebellious slaves, that the Spanish authority over them was absolute. However, the fugitives were able to defend themselves on several occasions. This was because their hiding places were difficult to access, and this allowed the Maroon to easily defend themselves. The rebellion was really fatal, the losses were high, and led to several further attacks on the Royal Road, which further destabilized the Viceregal economy. The Spanish authority eventually became helpless, as this clearly proved that waging a war against the Maroons was an unprofitable and hopeless enterprise. In 1609, there was news that the Africans intended to kill the inhabitants of the capital and crown Yanga as king. This really got the viceroy upset, and he quickly instructed the Spanish authorities to send a well-armed militia to defeat Yanga and his palanque. The troop of about 550 were led by Pedro González de Herrera, and they marched out from Puebla. About 100 soldiers in the troops were regulars, while the rest were conscripts and adventurers. The Maroons, on the other hand, were an irregular force with 100 fighters holding firearms and the other 400 armed with stones, machetes, bows, and arrows. At this time, Yanga was already old, so the troop was led by Francisco de la Matosa, an Angolan. Yanga was able to use his troop's superior knowledge of the terrain to resist the Spaniards. His goal was to cause the Spanish enough pain and draw them in for a negotiation. This strategy worked. As soon as the Spanish team approached, Yanga sent out his terms for peace via a captured Spaniard. He made a deal which was similar to that made between the Indians and Spaniards, which ended their hostility. The Indians requested for self-rule and agreed to support the Spaniards if they were never attacked. But the Spanish authorities were not ready to give up just yet. They sent another group to Yanga and his palanque, and they were faced with another strong defense from Yanga and his men. This time, both parties suffered severe casualties. After several other defeats, Yanga offered to make peace, but this time gave the Spaniards 11 conditions. Some of the most important conditions in his term was the recognition of the freedom of all of the palanque's residents prior to 1608, acknowledgement of the settlement as a legal entity, which Yanga and his descendants would govern, and the prohibition of any Spanish person in the community. And in turn, Yanga promised to serve and pay tribute to the Spanish crown. This took years of negotiations. Finally, in 1618, the treaty was signed and the town of San Lorenzo de los Negros was officially recognized by Spanish authorities as a free black settlement. By 1630, the town of San Lorenzo de los Negros de Saralvo was established. The town is located in today's Veracruz province and is now known as Yanga. In 1871, about 50 years after Mexico gained their independence, Yanga was designated as a national hero of Mexico and also named the El Primer Libertador de las Americas. Much of the story of Yanga was collected and published in an anthology in 1870 by Vicente Riva Palacio. He characterized the Maroons of San Lorenzo de los Negros as proud men who would not be defeated. Isabel de Oliveira. Typically, the 1500s and 1600s are defined by the activities of the male Spanish conquistadors and governors, whose names mark several streets and cities like Coronado, Peralta, de Vargas. The efforts of these men brought families of soldiers to settle in areas now called New Spain. Their efforts was to get back lands originally occupied by indigenous Pueblo peoples since the 13th century. There are so many documented horrors inflicted on the Pueblo people during the claim of their land by the Spanish. The victory over the Pueblo people are celebrated during the Entrada and other fiestas. However, while this happened, one woman was challenging the effort of the Spanish authority to affirm the survival of Catholicism and Spanish bloodlines while suppressing other faiths and ethnicities. You may have heard of the heroic stories of black women freedom fighters like Harriet Tubman, Rosa Parks, and Mary Ann Shadd. You've been taught the history of black women fighting for freedom. However, you may not know that women have been revolting against oppression as far back as the 16th century, with the effort of black women like Isabel de Oliveira. Isabel Oliveira was one of these women. In fact, she was at the forefront of it. Isabel was a free woman of African descent. She lived in Querétaro, Mexico, and joined a relief expedition, traveling on the Guerra de Reza expedition to Santa Fe. The mission of the expedition was to strengthen the Spanish claim to the colonized province of Santa Fe de Nuevo Mexico. During this period, she will travel as a servant to a Spanish woman. Although there is just very little story about her that is known, her impact and commitment to the liberation of enslaved African Americans remains a remarkable influence in Black history. She is well known for an extraordinary deposition that she filed with the mayor of Querétaro, Don Pedro Lorenzo de Castilla. She stood before 3 witnesses, a free black man, a mestiza woman, and a black slave woman, and dictated the following. I'm going on the expedition to New Mexico, and have some reason to fear that I may be annoyed by some individual, since I am a mulatta, and it is proper to protect my rights in such an eventuality by an affidavit showing that I am a free woman, unmarried, and the legitimate daughter of Hernando, a Negro, and an Indian named Magdalena. I therefore request your grace to accept this affidavit, which shows that I am free and not bound by marriage or slavery. I request that a properly certified and signed copy be given to me in order to protect my rights, and that it carry full legal authority. I demand justice. Although there is no clear record that Olvera's deposition may have protected her freedom during such a movement, the document somehow made its way into Spanish colonial archives. The document became a strong symbol of women and showcased Isabel's understanding of personal freedom. Olvera knew that her cherished freedom could be restricted in 2 ways. One was through slavery, and the other way was in marriage. With the cross-cultural and competitive histories of the colonizers of the African American continents, it's quite amazing that the expressed sentiments of a black woman survives until this day. Isabel's affidavit remains a legal document in the historical archives of 2 countries in both Mexico and the United States. It remains the oldest recorded example found of a black woman speaking up for herself. Although her journey started in Mexico, she deemed the document necessary for her travel to New Mexico. She demanded justice and respect for her existence, singleness, freedom, and future. What makes Isabel a more phenomenal woman was how she was able to understand the concept of freedom as a woman in a time when women had very little liberty. Not to mention that she was a black woman with a mixed racial heritage. The confidence embedded in her statement remains inspirational, and her character and determination would help lift the voices and strengthen the resolve of so many other freedom fighters. Isabel made her freedom a priority, and in Querétaro, her freedoms were a matter of public knowledge. The 3 witnesses also verified that Isabel de Olvera was an unmarried mulatto woman of free status. While she was scared that her freedom may be challenged as she moved up north, she still went on the journey, even though she knew that she may be annoyed by some individual, as she called it, on her expedition to New Mexico. Her powerful words still remain relevant even in our world today, as we live in a time when certain rights and liberties of women are being constantly threatened and trifled. It wasn't out of place that her rights would be trampled on while traveling with 73 soldiers. They took several items, such as food, livestock, and other supplies including nails, medicine, boots, powder, silver daggers, silk hats, linen shirts, and 8 dread bars of soap. Many scholars suggest that her statement was made to ensure that she was protected from advances from soldiers while they traveled. The stories about what happened to Olvera upon her arrival in New Mexico, her writing provided an understanding of women of that time, as the main records we have of black and mulatto women from this period come from church documentation of marriages, baptisms, and burials, and from court cases regarding witchcraft. Historians suggest that women of color in New Mexico sought power over their precarious situations and often abusive husbands by drawing on the help of local curanderas and medicine women. This resulted in the women being accused of practicing witchcraft. Others, like Isabel, appealed to governing bodies for protection of their status as free women. The significance of de Olvera's statement is an incredible explication of a black woman's attempt to navigate a patriarchal and Spanish-dominated system that was designed to keep women powerless. Olvera exemplifies the ongoing intermixing of indigenous American African peoples, the construction of race in colonial North America, and the presence of black women in New Mexico. From its earliest written records, Estevanico. We've heard stories of European explorers visiting and exploring Africa, but it seems as though Africans were a bunch of primitive people that never left their lands and never had to explore or see other worlds. But one man makes us see otherwise. Estevanico, also known as Esteban de Durantes or Mustafa Azamori, was born in Azamor, Morocco in 1500 and was said to have disappeared in 1539. He is recorded as the first African to explore North America. There is very little written about his background. Some contemporary records show that he's from the Maghreb region of North Africa. However, in some of the recent accounts, he goes by his personal nicknames, Estevanico, which means Little Stephen, or Azamori, and El Negro, which is a common name in Spanish meaning the black. Different translations of the Spanish accounts describe him as an Arabic-speaking black man and a native of Azamor. Estevanico was sold into slavery in 1522 at a very young age, while growing up in the Portuguese-controlled Moroccan town of Azamor, right on the Atlantic coast. He was sold to a Spanish nobleman, Andrés Durantes de Carranza. The nature of slave trade in Spain was quite different from what was seen in the transatlantic slave trade. In Spain, the slaves had several paths to freedom. It is not clear whether Azamori was raised as a Muslim in Morocco, but he must have definitely converted to Christianity. This is because the Spanish Empire at the time didn't allow non-Catholics to travel to New Spain, so he must have converted to Catholicism before he was allowed to be a part of the expedition. He was given the Christian name Esteban, which is Spanish for Stephen, after his baptism. Estevanico was part of the Narvaez expedition with some other 300 men. The expedition was led by the newly appointed governor of La Florida, Panfilo de Narvaez. They left Cuba in February 1528 on a mission to go to Isla de las Palmas, near present-day Tampico, Mexico. They planned to establish new settlements in that region. However, strong winds forced them to the western coast of Florida. The fleet fortunately landed in present-day St. Petersburg, Florida, on the shores of Boca Ciega Bay. Narvaez was dissatisfied and ordered his ships with 100 men and 10 women to sail north in search of a large harbor, which he was assured was nearby. He then led another 300 men with 42 horses and moved along the coast with hopes of rejoining with his ships at the large harbor. Unfortunately, there was no border north of Boca Ciega Bay, and Narvaez never saw his ships again. The group later marched 300 miles north and got into an armed confrontation with the Native Americans. The survivors built boats to sail westward along the Gulf Coast shoreline with hopes of reaching Pianuco and the Rio de las Palmas. Unfortunately, they faced a storm when they were near Galveston Island, Texas. Just 80 men out of the 300 survived the storm and were washed ashore at Galveston Island. In 1529, Estevanico and 2 other survivors from one boat became enslaved by Coalitican Indians. In 1532, they were reunited with a survivor from another boat, and the 4 survivors spent years as slaves on the Texas Barrier Islands. In 1534, Estevanico and other 3 survivors, Andrés Durantes de Carranza, Alonso del Castillo Maldonado, and Cabeza de Vaca, finally escaped their captivity and traveled west into present-day Texas in southwestern US and northern Mexico. They became medicine men. As medicine men, they served as traditional healers and spiritual leaders, serving the indigenous people of the Americas. They became the first Europeans and Africans to enter the American West. They walked a total of 2,000 miles after landing in Florida and finally reached the Spanish settlement in Sinaloa. After some time, they left there and traveled 1,000 miles to the south to Mexico City. Traveling as medicine men, Estevanico and his other 3 companions were welcomed and treated with great respect. They were offered food, shelter, and gifts from different villages, who also held celebrations in their honor. They moved from one village to another, and oftentimes followed by more than 3,000 people. Estevanico and his other 3 companions traveled through different parts of the continent and western Mexico, into the Sonoran Desert, to the region of Sonora in New Spain, which is present-day Mexico. After finding a small Spanish settlement, the 4 survivors traveled 1,000 miles to the south of Mexico City and arrived in July 1536. In 1542, Cabeza de Vaca published the Relación, a book that chronicled their 8-year survival journey and also detailed the life of Estevanico. It was reprinted in 1555 and became the first published book to describe the people, wildlife, flora, and fauna of inland North America, and was also the first to describe the American bison. In the book, Cabeza de Vaca often referred to Estevanico as their leader, as he went ahead of the other 3 survivors. He had learned some parts of the indigenous language and was able to interact with them. When Estevanico arrived in Mexico City, Antonio de Mendoza, who was the viceroy of New Spain, appointed him as the guide in expeditions to the north. In 1539, Estevanico left Mexico City and traveled to Sinaloa. There, he accompanied Friar Marcos de Niza as the guide in search of the fabled 7 cities of Cibola, preceding Coronado by a year. Estevanico was also appointed by the viceroy of New Spain in 1539 to serve as the main guide for a return expedition to the southwest, led by Fray Marcos de Niza. He went ahead of the main team with another group of Sonoran Indians. During this period, he was instructed to communicate back to the main party by sending crosses. It was agreed that the size of the cross should be equal to the wealth discovered. One day, a cross arrived that was as tall as a person, and this caused Niza and his main party to step up their pace in order to join the scouts. This happened when Estevanico reached the village of Hawica which is in present-day New Mexico. Sadly, this was where Estevanico met his end. Marcos de Niza reported in his own accounts that Estevanico was killed in the pueblo of Hawica in 1539. Estevanico became the first non-native to visit Pueblo lands. There is no clear record of the cause or manner of Estevanico's death, and there may never be any. All of the stories of his death are based on legend and speculation. Some historians have also narrated that he was killed because the Zuni did not believe that he was a representative of the European Party. Others speculate that he was killed for demanding turquoise and women. Another account said that because Estevan wore owl feathers and carried a medicine man's gourd, the Zuni people may have thought that he was impersonating a medicine man, which made them kill him. A different account in 2002 by Francisco Mara suggested that the Zuni did not kill Estevanico, but rather he and his friends remained among the Ashui people, who probably helped him fake his death so he could regain his freedom. Some folklore even say that the Kachina figure, Chacuena, is based on Estevanico. However, both in historical and modern depictions, Estevanico is shown as a great explorer, a physical and moral guide.